Hello everyone, and welcome to our keynote lecture for Ancient Studies Week 2021. Duane Roller is going to talk to us about Cleopatra, the most famous woman in classical antiquity. Duane Roller is the Jedi Master who instructed me back at Ohio State, where he is a professor emeritus in Greek and Latin. And he is one of the leading experts in ancient geography and certainly knows more than anyone else about Strabo inter alia. He has also written on Herod the Great, Juba II and Cleopatra Selene, royal women of the Augustan period, Eratosthenes, and I am doubtless forgetting several things in addition to that. So thank you so much for coming. I'm so glad to have you. And here we go.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Molly. I'm very glad to be here. Glad to see all of you. And I think we can easily say that we've all heard of Cleopatra. She was the Greek queen of Egypt who was successfully the lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She lost her kingdom to the Romans because she could not control her hormones, and she was probably the most famous woman from classical antiquity. We see her dramatized by Elizabeth Taylor, Claudette Colbert. We see her as Shakespeare's tragic heroine, subject of art by Delacroix, Handel, Berlioz, and many others. And her reputation since her death seems to transcend that of her real life. But who was the real Cleopatra? Was she any of the above? Or was she a victim not of her passions, but her later reputation? History, to paraphrase Bernard Shaw, is written by the winners who always lie, and Cleopatra lost. The real Cleopatra is notoriously difficult to grasp. First, we really have to forget everything that we've seen in art or music or popular culture. The actual sources for the queen are elusive and scattered. Even before her death in 30 BC, Roman literary propaganda was hard at work damning her memory. Horace called her the frenzied queen, mad and drunk with lust. Virgil could call her nothing more than the Egyptian mate of Antony. Thoughts such as these determined the image of Cleopatra forever. Contemporary documents from before her death are almost non-existent, and even then sanitized. Julius Caesar, in his report on conditions in Alexandria in the 40s BC, states that he restored her to the throne, but discreetly avoids mentioning any other contact he had with her. Cicero knew her, but didn't like her. Even before she died, it was impossible to assess Cleopatra without bias, and the fact that she was a woman didn't help. 100 years after her death, the Greek scholar Plutarch, in his biography of Antony, wrote in detail about Cleopatra, our most complete source. Although Plutarch was also subject to the prejudices that had canonized her as a dangerous threat to Rome, his grandfather knew people who had worked with Cleopatra. And through this source, Plutarch provided us with a rare eyewitness report on the queen, one that is not tangled with Roman political rhetoric. And Plutarch says, her beauty, we are told, was not totally incomparable, and did not really impress those who saw her, but conversation with her was irresistibly charming, and her presence, along with the persuasiveness of her discussion and her character, which affected those around her, was particularly stimulating. Her voice was especially sweet, and she could easily make use of whatever language she wished, so that when she had discussions with barbarians, she hardly ever needed an interpreter, but answered most of them without assistance. whether they were Ethiopians, Troglodytes, Hebrews, Arabians, Syrians, Medes, or Parthians. It is said that she learned many other languages, although her predecessors as Egyptian kings had not even attempted to learn the local language. That's the real Cleopatra, and perhaps the only honest surviving account of the queen. We don't have much visual iconography of Cleopatra, and I'll just run through some examples real quickly here. This is a portrait in Berlin. It's probably the most authentic portrait of Cleopatra in the Greco-Roman style, but the attribution is totally art historical. There is no identification, and obviously it's heavily idealized. It was found from an uncertain Italian source, but it gives us perhaps a pretty good view of what the queen might have looked like. Interestingly, most of what we have of her visually is in the Egyptian mode, which of course puts certain strictures on the representation that are somewhat alien to our own classical background. This is a portrait in the Rosicrucian Museum in San Jose, California. It is identified as Cleopatra because it has her name on it. But again, it shows her as an Egyptian or Egyptianizing queen. It's said that she always appeared at state functions dressed like Isis, and we perhaps have a hint of this. And we have quite a few coins of Cleopatra. Coins have both strengths and weaknesses. They are immediate. They are chronologically fixed. And you can see this one on the far side. It says Cleopatra Basilissa. But at the same time, the portrait is not very good. And coins, because they are struck for the moment, often to raise money out of bulk silver and gold, may not be of high artistic quality. And so this may be what Cleopatra looked like. She certainly has a royal diadem, but again, it's hardly idealizing. And we can look at another one that in one sense is even worse. This is one from near the end of the life, the end of her life. The pie on the far side is a mint mark from Patras, where Antony and Cleopatra spent the winter of 31 BC, just before the Battle of Actium. So this is Cleopatra near the end of her life, when she might well have been very stressed out. This is a woman only 39 years of age, but a woman who'd had 4 children and a miscarriage and a very difficult last few years. But again, it depends on the artistic abilities of the die cutter more than anything else. But these last ones we've looked at are essentially the only portraits of Cleopatra from life. There's one more which we'll get to in a moment, but I'll leave that for a minute. So, how did this talented woman end up being Queen of Egypt, the last major independent Greek ruler to fall to the Romans? To understand this, we have to go back to the year 323 BC and the death of Alexander the Great. Alexander died in Babylon after returning from his epic journey to India. All along the route, he had founded cities that he named after himself, including one in Egypt at the western mouth of the Nile. But when Alexander died at the age of 33, he left no instructions about what to do with these vast territories that extended all the way from Macedonia to the Indus River. He'd acquired them. He didn't know anything about ruling them. Squabbling, to put it mildly, immediately broke out between his companions and relatives, creating a long and convoluted process that lasted for the next 40 years. Of interest to us is one of these companions, a certain Ptolemy, a childhood friend of the king's, who, in the midst of the infighting, pulled off a major coup. He hijacked Alexander's body, which probably had been intended to be buried back in the royal precinct in Macedonia. He hijacked the body and took it to Egypt because he was royal governor there. His possession of the body, which soon was to be enshrined in a great tomb in Alexandria, gave him immense status, unequaled by any of the other companions of Alexander. By 305, he was calling himself King of Egypt and created a Greek kingdom in Egypt that was to last for 275 years. Although, unlike his famous descendant, he never bothered to learn the Egyptian language. Cleopatra was, in fact, his direct descendant, his great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter. So, the Greek kingdom, Greco-Macedonian kingdom of the Ptolemies, was established in Egypt by the end of the 4th century. And we can skip over the next 250 years. Although it's worth remembering that largely through the efforts of Ptolemy's son and grandson, Ptolemy II and Ptolemy III, Alexandria became the greatest city in the Mediterranean world. Its outstanding cultural and intellectual center, where scientific and artistic achievement reached new levels. The world's greatest library was created, and scholars came from all over the world to perform great feats, to determine the size and the shape of the earth, confirming that it was a sphere, and that one could reach India by sailing west across the Mediterranean. They invented geometry and trigonometry, and some even suggested that the sun, not the earth, was at the center of the universe. That and much more was the product of the intellectual world of Ptolemaic Egypt. The history of Ptolemaic Egypt isn't what we're worried about here. We skip over the generations and resume our tale early in the 1st century BC. By that time, a new factor has entered the politics of the Mediterranean, and that, of course, is the Romans. Rome had reached great power status with the final defeat of Carthage in 146. 60 years earlier, it had begun to involve itself in the politics of the Greek world. The astute Ptolemies, always able to recognize the broad currents of world politics, had made a treaty with Rome as early as the 3rd century. And in the following century, it became increasingly common to involve Rome in the convoluted dynastic politics of the Ptolemies. Invoking Roman guardianship of one's children, or even willing the Egyptian kingdom outright to the Romans, something that never happened, but it was thought about a lot, became commonplace. Although the wills were never implemented, because the reason you will your kingdom to Rome is to tell your children that you're not going to get it if you die suddenly, and that never happened. So by the early 1st century BC, Roman and Egyptian interests had been intertwined for well over a century, and the Ptolemaic Dynasty, in power for over 200 years, was showing the strains of constant rivalry and frequent inbreeding. The old Egyptian custom of brother-sister marriage, extreme endogamy, keeping the bloodline within the family. You have children with someone you know, not someone you don't know. But it was taking its toll. In 80 BC, the 12th Ptolemy came to the throne. Ptolemy the 12th. He's not remembered well by the historical record, and he soon came to be called the flute player, allegedly because he preferred to party rather than to rule. He soon married his sister, who had the name of Cleopatra, not our Cleopatra, but Cleopatra was a dynastic name that had been used by the Ptolemies since the earliest times. In fact, the original Cleopatra was the sister of Alexander the Great. So the name was very distinguished. Ptolemy the flute player had several children, although not all by Cleopatra. And of greatest importance are two boys, the future Ptolemy 13 and 14, and several daughters, including one named Arsinoe, who we'll come back to, and most importantly, our Cleopatra, the seventh in the dynasty to bear that name, born in the winter of 70-69 to an unknown mother, perhaps a member of an Egyptian priestly family. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, spent the first decade of his rule in relative peace and quiet. But his use of Roman connections and power to consolidate his position eventually resulted in his expulsion from Egypt. He soon turned up in the city of Rome itself, petitioning anyone who would listen for restoration. Eventually, the Romans took heed. It was said that Ptolemy's lavish spreading of wealth helped, and the governor of Syria was ordered to restore him to the throne. On the governor's staff at that time was a young Roman officer in his first overseas post named Mark Antony. Antony and the governor arrived in Alexandria in 55 and effected the restoration, using the Roman army to enforce their decision. We don't really know very much about Cleopatra during this period. She doesn't enter history until 3 years later. Children, especially female ones, normally don't have a very high profile in the historical record. But we can only imagine that Cleopatra as an adolescent had many of the characteristics that she was to have later in life, and probably made herself at the age of 14 very conspicuous to the Roman officers who visited her father's court. One suspects that Antony, 27 years of age and early in his career, was probably quite taken by the young princess, and never realizing how their paths might cross at a later date. Cleopatra enters the historical record in 52, when at the age of 17 her father made her co-regent, along with her brother Ptolemy XIII. Their father was well aware that the children had already shown signs of contentiousness that could endanger the continuation of the dynasty, and he asked the Romans to ensure a proper succession after his death. When in Rome, Ptolemy had been hosted by Pompey the Great, nearing the peak of his career as the most powerful Roman, and it was Pompey who was to personally supervise the succession. So in 51 BC, Ptolemy the flute player died. Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII become joint rulers, and legally at least husband and wife. I say legally because Ptolemy XIII was only 11. Yet their father's worries were well-founded. And within a few months, Cleopatra expelled her brother. She's 18 years old, and she's already showing the determination that would mark her life. For the next 2 years, the rulers fought back and forth, each expelling the other from Alexandria. Cleopatra's position gradually weakened as her brother, having the support of the Ptolemaic court, gradually gained the upper hand, and she was forced into exile in Syria, where she had relatives. Meanwhile, events in Rome would soon affect Egypt. Pompey the Great, who was virtually the sole ruler of Rome, had marginalized his opponents, most importantly the dynamic Julius Caesar, banishing him to a lengthy post in Gaul, and obviously hoping he might never return. But in early 49, Caesar suddenly and unexpectedly returned to Rome, crossing the Rubicon River, and Pompey fled to Greece, where he was militarily defeated. Remembering his role as guardian of the Egyptian dynasty, he sought sanctuary there, only to be killed by a faction opposing Roman intervention as he stepped from his ship onto the shore. Caesar arrived a few days later. Caesar immediately undertook Pompey's role to bring an end to the quarreling rulers. But battles between the factions continued. And sometime during this period, the summer of 48, Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers. This is the famous incident where she was wrapped up in bedclothes and smuggled into Caesar's presence. Two of the most dynamic people of the era had now met on both personal and political terms. Needless to say, before long, Caesar was favoring her position over that of her brother, and soon Ptolemy XIII was killed in one of the frequent battles between the factions. By the beginning of 47, Cleopatra was sole ruler. And she inherited a territory that we not only think of as Egypt, traditional area of Egypt, but west along the African coast, as far west as she should claim. The area around Carthage was Roman territory, but Cleopatra claimed the area of Cyrene, modern Libya. Up along the Levantine coast, good chunks of southeastern Asia Minor, Cyprus, and the eastern end of Crete, where the Ptolemies had naval bases. So we think of Cleopatra as queen of Egypt, but she really is queen of a large amount of territory in the eastern Mediterranean. The only intrusion into this territory is the kingdom of Judea there, where you see Cleopatra just has the narrow strip along the coast. The Hasmonean rulers of Judea had their own independent kingdom. So we're at the beginning of 47. Cleopatra is now sole ruler of all of this territory, certainly from Cyrene all the way around to Crete. And it's at this point that any analysis becomes very difficult, and we have to be cautious. We all know that people smitten with one another may make errors of judgment, but at the same time we have to remember that Caesar and Cleopatra were hardly ordinary people. Both were, legally at least, married to others. Both were powerful personalities whose political situation was severely threatened. The death of Pompey had not ended the civil war in Rome. It was to continue for another 18 years. And Cleopatra's short reign had been marked by more time in exile than anywhere else. She spent most of her reign in Syria and only came back when it was clear that Caesar would support her. Certainly there was a genuine personal attachment between Caesar and Cleopatra, and both were people noted for their charm and charisma. But it's a mistake to see it as purely hormonal, to see it how it is in the received tradition, such as Bernard Shaw's play. Personal liaisons between Greek and Roman people of power were not essentially for hormonal reasons. They were a source of power. Cleopatra knew exactly what she was doing connecting with Caesar, allying herself with the most powerful living Roman. That assured her survival as queen. Nevertheless, it's Caesar who's kind of in trouble now, because he may have overstepped the bounds of propriety. He was married to a very distinguished Roman woman, Calpurnia, of an old and distinguished family. Moreover, he and Calpurnia were childless, so it was very easy to twist all of this and saying, well, I couldn't get a child from my lawful Roman wife, so I went and made it with a barbarian queen, and therefore that is where my heir is going to be. For the time being, he acted cautiously. And when he proclaimed queen at the beginning of 47, to be careful, he also named her surviving younger brother, the 14th Ptolemy, as joint ruler. Caesar and Cleopatra spent the autumn and winter and into the spring of 48-7 living together, something that didn't go over well in either Egypt or Rome. Caesar was seen as forsaking his wife for a barbarian queen. Cleopatra was seen as playing around with a Roman instead of running her kingdom. And Cleopatra may have miscalculated in becoming so dependent on Caesar, whose position was supported by 3 legions. Caesar, of course, is outside of Roman territory. The Romans did not control Egypt. That makes his position as a magistrate of the Roman Republic legally dubious. And he was seen in Rome as an adulterer and as a person gaining too much power, a de facto king. Moreover, it became obvious in early 47 that Cleopatra was pregnant. In April, Caesar returned to Rome and his wife. 2 months later, on the 23rd of June, Cleopatra's child was born, who was given the name Ptolemy XV Caesar. Soon it was conventional wisdom that Caesar was the father, and the child came to be known as Kaisarian, Little Caesar. Was Kaisarian Caesar's child? In an absolute sense, we'll never know. Probably, though, although Caesar tried to play it in every possible way, he was quite diffident about the matter, in part because of his legal childless marriage in Rome. In Egypt, Kaisarian was certainly regarded as Caesar's child, but Caesar allegedly denied paternity in his will. And here we have one portrait of Kaisarian. Cleopatra's at the far side. Kaisarian in front of her. This is Isis over here. And it's clearly a iconographic statement of presenting Kaisarian to the goddess as the heir. As a matter of fact, when this was done, Kaisarian was just a few years old, but he's presented as an adult, almost equal to Cleopatra. But again, it's in the Egyptian style, so it tells us nothing that we can comprehend about physical features. And then it's hard to see, but if you look at the coin here, Cleopatra's holding a little baby. And that's going to be Kaisarian. Caesar, when he left behind his 3 legions. And that, in one sense, didn't go over well with the Egyptians. Again, he's not in Roman territory. What are the legions doing there? But it ensures the immediate peace and prosperity of Cleopatra's rule. And a year later, in the summer of 46, Cleopatra invited the queen and her brother, Ptolemy XV, who remember they're joint rulers, to Rome and established them in one of his villas across the Tiber, the area now called Trastevere in modern Rome. And the two were officially recognized as rulers who were allied and friendly to the Roman people, which is a legal term, rex socius et amicus, conferring a certain amount of legal status. But the presence of Cleopatra in Rome didn't go over well with a lot of people. Cicero, whose surviving letters are a rare contemporary account of the era, was quick to express his distaste at the person he calls that queen. He never names her. Caesar's legal wife, as I said, Calpurnia, came from one of the most distinguished families in Rome and was seen as a victim. There certainly is no objection to Roman soldiers on campaign having local liaisons. But to bring them back home as Agamemnon had found out previously, and to, moreover, bring the child of the liaison home, is overstepping the bounds of propriety. So opposition to Caesar mounted for many reasons, including the situation of with Cleopatra. And when the assassins led by Brutus and Cassius struck on the Ides of March in 44, the presence of Cleopatra, still in Rome, was certainly a factor. And she stayed on in Rome, trying now to get Kaisarian named as her successor with the new regime. Whatever that might be, we have to remember when Caesar was assassinated, the surviving consul was Mark Antony, who's effective head of state now. So this brings Cleopatra and Antony into contact a second time. When she went back to Egypt in the summer of 44, late spring or summer of 44, she declared Kaisarian as her heir apparent. And strengthening her position, she eliminated her brother, Ptolemy XV, who was joint ruler. At least we think she did. He just disappears from the record. For the next few years, she settled down to her role as queen. Times were difficult in Egypt. Her father had seriously diminished Egyptian resources in his lavish expenditures to secure his throne, and there were repeated famines and plagues, not unlike the situation depicted 1,000 years earlier in the book of Exodus. The Nile was at a historic low. Cleopatra moved quickly to assess the situation, dispensing royal resources, especially grain stockpiles, to the people. And it would probably was in this period that Plutarch describes how she received ambassadors from all over the eastern Mediterranean and could speak to them in their own language. Ptolemaic Egypt. We want to look at the map again. Ptolemaic Egypt was not the power that it had been 2 centuries previously. But as we can see, and as we mentioned, its reach was still very extensive. Cleopatra stabilized the situation and began to restore Egypt to its former prosperity. Yet things were not quiet in Rome. Caesar's murder had not brought the expected end to the Civil War. As Shakespeare says, it unleashed the dogs of war. And of course, with the death of Caesar, Mark Antony is now in charge. And he presumably expected to be Caesar's heir. Being an heir, being in a person's will in Rome, confers status as well as personal property. But Caesar left his powers to his little-known grandnephew, Octavian, and in the process offended just about everybody. In particular, his only alleged son, Kaisarian, and Antony. But Antony and Octavian worked together for a while and disposed swiftly of Caesar's murderers. Cleopatra had sought to become involved with this. She sent her fleet to oppose the murderers of Caesar into Greece, but circumstances conspired to marginalize her role, and she was not present when Brutus and Cassius were defeated at Philippi in the autumn of 42. After Philippi, Octavian returned west while Antony remained in the east to ensure there was no residual support for the assassins. And it's a peculiar twist of fate that he was chosen for this role because he'd already met Cleopatra twice, as we've said. And one kind of wonders exactly what his motive was in summoning her to his headquarters at Tarsus, the old Assyrian trading post at the northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea. He summoned many of the kings of the East, but he seemed particularly interested in having Cleopatra come. And again, we come to another famous moment in Cleopatra's life, described by Plutarch and obtained from an eyewitness source. She sailed up the Kidnus River in a boat with a golden stern. Purple sails spread, the rowers pulling the silver oars to the sound of flute, pipes, and strings. She herself reclined under a canopy adorned with gold, looking like a painting of Aphrodite, with boys like cupids in paintings standing on either side and fanning her. In addition, her most beautiful serving maids were positioned like nereids or graces at the tiller and the lines. Marvelous scents from innumerable incense offerings spread along the river bank. It was said everywhere that Aphrodite had come to celebrate with Dionysus for the good of Asia. And I think we can be assured that this is derived from an eyewitness account because of the mention of the marvelous scents as well as the very visual aspect of the description. Cleopatra, of course, invited Antony for dinner on board, and that soon turned into something more. Antony wasn't seen for quite a while thereafter. Again, we must remember that Cleopatra was making a political statement in seducing Antony. She needed him politically. Her position in Egypt was still precarious. She had failed to win legal status for her only child, and she still had a surviving sister, Arsinoe, who was in Ephesus, gathering support as the legal queen of Egypt. Like Caesar a few years previously, Antony was the most powerful Roman around. Octavian was young and untested and could easily be dismissed, as Cicero had done. He said, we'll humor him for a while and then get rid of him. Cicero's worst mistake. Antony could be of great use to Cleopatra in consolidating her kingdom and restoring Ptolemaic glory, perhaps even expanding her territories into the Levant, North Africa, areas that the Ptolemies had once had. Dynastic survival was always a priority of ancient royalty, and Cleopatra was 28, and even though she had a child, she had no legal heir because of the conflicted birthing issues of Kaisarian. Seducing Antony helped on this front. He came to Egypt for the winter of 41-40, much as Caesar had for the winter of 47-6, and the two lived a lavish life, about which many anecdotes survive, some of which may be true. But an indisputable fact is that in the summer of 40, Cleopatra gave birth to twins fathered by Antony, which she named Alexander and Cleopatra. The message was obvious. The wonderful days of Alexander the Great would soon return, and little Cleopatra would carry on her mother's image. And it's necessary to point out the obvious here, too, and that is for a queen to produce an heir is a much more difficult process than a king, simply because of the biological realities. So Cleopatra had to be very careful in choosing her partners, and of course very careful in being available for the process of pregnancy and birth, whereas the descendant of a king really need not be involved in the birthing process at all. So as a Roman magistrate for the East, remember after the death of Caesar, Antony and Octavian had effectively divided the world between themselves. He began to use these to favor Cleopatra, steadily giving territory to her at Roman expense. He also, probably at her request, eliminated Cleopatra's sole surviving sibling Arsinoe, still at Ephesus. Before long, the Ptolemaic Empire was indeed being reconstituted. But the year 40 BC saw two peculiar twists. First, Antony returned to Rome and married Octavian's sister, Octavia, making it appear that his time with Cleopatra was just the dalliance of a soldier on campaign. And second, Cleopatra found a new rival, not a personal but a political one, and that is the dynamic young king of Judea, Herod, soon to be surnamed the Great, who came to the throne in 40 and had his own ideas about reconstituting his own kingdom, extending to the borders of Egypt and north into Syria. In fact, Cleopatra was so quick to realize that Herod could be a problem that she offered Herod the job of military chief of staff in Egypt, which Herod astutely declined. Antony returned to the east in 37. He'd been happily living as a married man in Rome for 3 years, living with Octavia. Children had been born. One could even say he'd forgotten about Cleopatra at this point. But the Romans were having difficulty with the Parthians. Parthians up there in the right-hand side, essentially in Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. And they were beginning to threaten not only Roman Syria. Syria was a Roman province. Herod's kingdom is a little indentation below Syria, but also threatening the upper parts of Cleopatra's kingdom. And Antony was sent to make war on the Parthians to secure the east. If the Parthians could be eliminated, the eastern Mediterranean would either be under Roman control or two people beholden to the Romans, Cleopatra and Herod. So in the autumn of 37, Antony set up his headquarters at Antioch in Syria, actually near Antioch at a resort named Daphne. And soon Cleopatra joined Antony. And it's at this point that things begin to change. Antony's motives become more inscrutable, and he becomes more dependent on her and less on Rome. In fact, he was never to return to Rome for the rest of his life. The Parthian campaign would have seemed momentarily forgotten as the two resumed their luxurious way of life. And among other things, Antony acknowledged his paternity of the twins, which again raises very convoluted legal questions regarding his children by his legal wife, his children by Cleopatra. The twins were now 3 years old, and soon another child was born named Ptolemy. So Antony and Cleopatra have these children, each with a dynastic name, each pointing toward the future, reminding the people of Alexander, reminding the people of the Ptolemaic Dynasty, and reminding people of the historicity of the name Cleopatra. Despite the emphasis in the sources on the lavish lifestyle of Antony and Cleopatra, Antony really, for a while at least, was hard at work in reorganizing the East, whether he was doing it for himself, for Cleopatra, or Rome. The details don't concern us really, but the effect was to create a more powerful Egyptian kingdom restored to its former glory. And it's at this time rumors begin to circulate that he was to be the next king of Egypt. Cleopatra, of course, even brought Herod on board, implying that he could be part of this new empire of the East that was a counterpart to Rome. And of all the messianic talk that was circulating in the Eastern Mediterranean at this time, and of course would reach its peak half a century later with Jesus of Nazareth, one candidate for the Messiah who would eliminate the Romans and restore the world to its former glory was, in fact, Cleopatra. Gradually, the Eastern Mediterranean took shape as a world dominated by Cleopatra, and Herod was now her vassal rather than the vassal of the Romans. And Antony and Cleopatra even struck coinage together, coins with both their portraits, which again has a political significance and brings into question just exactly what Antony's relationship to Rome is. And the line between a Roman magistrate and an Egyptian queen was now blurred. They were now speaking with one voice. And this didn't go over well in Rome. Octavian had consolidated his power, and Antony was still married to Octavian's sister. So it begins to have elements of a family as well as a political squabble. Finally, Antony's Parthian campaign set forth in 36. Remember, that was why he'd been sent to the east over a year previously. But the campaign ended in disaster. Tens of thousands were allegedly killed. Cleopatra was in charge of the evacuation of the survivors. Antony was a skilled military tactician. He'd been with Caesar for quite a few years, but everything went wrong. He had bad advice from his local guides. He wasn't prepared for the harsh winters of the Iranian plateau. The problems just go on and on. And so Cleopatra evacuated the survivors, and the two ended up again in Alexandria. Antony was too embarrassed to go home to Rome, and his reputation there was sinking fast. And when Octavia, his wife, offered to finance a repeat campaign, she was turned down. Octavian saw this as an insult to his sister. She was very popular in Rome. And he began to engage, that's Octavian, began to engage a propaganda machine that sought to depict Antony as captive of a Greek seductress. And this is where many of the stories begin to be generated. It was becoming apparent that Antony could never return to Rome, and in fact, he was to spend the rest of his life with Cleopatra. In the spring of 34, a great ceremony in the gymnasium of Alexandria confirmed the couple's vision of the future. All of Cleopatra's siblings were conveniently dead and had left no heirs, so there were no rivals. The future of Egypt, and indeed one could say the whole East, was in the control of Antony and Cleopatra and their offspring. Cleopatra received the title Queen of Egypt, Queen of Kings. 14-year-old Kaisarian became King of Kings and was vigorously put forth as the only legitimate heir of Julius Caesar. A very definite slight to Octavian, of course. The younger children were given territory. Alexander was given everything east of the Euphrates. Cleopatra Selene was given Libya, and little Ptolemy was given Syria and Phoenicia. Forthcoming royal marriages were arranged for all the children. As Antony and Cleopatra would have it, all the Eastern Mediterranean, from southern Asia Minor around to central North Africa, was now theirs. With a network of alliances, there are other petty kings and queens scattered through this area, like Herod, but lesser ones. Keep them under control, and everything, the whole arc of the Eastern Mediterranean, was under their control. And Cleopatra began to try and chip away at Herod's territories and began to compress them to some extent. This only intensified the propaganda war emanating from Rome. Octavian, using the treatment of his sister as a pretext, skillfully turned public opinion against Antony. The giving away of Roman territory didn't help. Cyrene which Cleopatra Selene was supposed to rule, the daughter, that was Roman territory. Other bits and pieces here, especially in southern Asia Minor, are Roman territory, but Antony has given them to his children. That's a big no-no. Even though it was legally within Antony's power, he had broad powers, still a Roman magistrate, still under the rules that had been established nearly 10 years previously with the death of Julius Caesar, that Antony could really do whatever he wanted to bring peace and stability to the Eastern Mediterranean. But it was impolitic, no denying that. Favoring Kaisarian was, of course, a personal offense to Octavian, because Octavian had put himself forth as Caesar's true and legitimate heir and owed much of his power and position to that fact. The straight-laced Romans were still suspicious enough of Greeks and the indulgent lifestyle of Eastern royalty that it was particularly disagreeable to see Antony living that role. And throughout 33 BC, dueling communiques emanated from Rome and Alexandria, each side accusing the other of impropriety. Octavian emphasized Antony's adultery, his dispensing of Roman territory, and his lavish Eastern lifestyle. Antony and Cleopatra in turn questioned Octavian's very legitimacy as the heir of Caesar, suggesting they were the world of the future and that they were prepared to transform Rome into a Greek monarchy of immense strength and wealth. And of course, as I said, it was even believed that Cleopatra might be the Messiah of the East. At the end of 33, Antony's magisterial term expired. It had been 5 years, once renewable, so this was 10 years. This meant that he had no longer any legal position in Rome, and he became totally dependent on Cleopatra, especially for finances. Octavian began to attack him openly in the Senate, especially since Antony and Cleopatra continued to travel around the East together and to supply the Roman armies in this region, ensuring that the Roman armies in Asia Minor and Syria and Cyrene, all of which would be loyal to them rather than the central government of Rome. Octavian began to identify Cleopatra as the true enemy of Rome. And remember, Antony is still his brother-in-law. So it could easily be argued that Cleopatra had seduced Antony both physically and mentally into betraying his obligations as a Roman. Antony and Cleopatra moved. They were in Ephesus, they were in Samos, they were in Athens, all famous and distinguished Greek cities now under Roman control, but demonstrating that they were the true rulers of the East and marginalizing the Roman presence, or when they started paying the Roman officers and armies in the area, connecting them to themselves rather than to Rome. Lavish living continued to be the rule, although probably exaggerated by the Roman propaganda machine. But there were stories of dinner parties at which pearls were dissolved in vinegar and which guests were given the silver table service as gifts. But they were immensely popular. Wherever they went, they were enthusiastically welcomed. And their benign monarchy, even if lavish, was more suitable to the history of the region than the new Roman ways. They could claim a heritage going back to Alexander the Great. The Romans were upstarts. In the time of Alexander the Great, nobody had ever heard of the Romans in the Eastern Mediterranean. And there was little opposition to their presence except what emanated from Rome. Cleopatra's had immense financial resources. The Ptolemaic Dynasty at its poorest was far more wealthy than Rome, and Cleopatra could finance their activities and keep the armies loyal. In the late spring of 32, Cleopatra finally convinced Antony to send Octavia a letter of divorce. and that cut off his last significant tie with Rome. This, of course, gave Octavian the ammunition he needed. He saw it as an insult to his family and tantamount to a declaration of war. Octavian gained possession of Antony's will, which was on file in Rome, and staged a public reading of it. And in Antiquity, as we've seen with Caesar, a will was as much a political statement as a matter of inheritance. And Antony's will said everything Octavian could have wanted it to say, so conveniently, in fact, that it's long been suggested to be a forgery. Antony stressed that Kaisarian was the true heir of Julius Caesar and expressed his desire to be buried alongside of Cleopatra in Alexandria, even to have his body removed back to Alexandria if he should die in Rome. This caused great public outcry in Rome, and it began to be rumored that Alexandria was to be the new capital of a reconstituted Roman Empire. The propaganda machine began to intensify. Words like dangerous, monster, calamitous, ruinous began to be used to describe Cleopatra. She was said to have practiced witchcraft on Antony, causing him to betray his heritage as a Roman. What had begun as a family struggle had evolved into an ideological quarrel for the future of Rome, and by late 32, a fight for the future of the Eastern Mediterranean. But it's clear that Cleopatra was by no means the irrational monster that Rome presented her as. She made no attempt to attack Rome, or even to move far from her territories. To her, the only issue was the survival and defense of her kingdom, and she probably believed that Rome would not move so far as to attack Egypt directly, which was a fatal miscalculation. Nevertheless, Antony and Cleopatra sent their fleet to the west coast of Greece, and this is where the coin in Patras, which is just above the A in Athens, was struck. They could reconnoiter a possible Roman move to the east. And the summer of 31 was spent in a naval blockade, with the forces of Egypt blocking the Romans from moving out of the southern Italian ports like at Brindisi and into northwest Greece. But soon the Romans gained the upper hand because of supply lines. The Romans close to Italy were better supplied than Antony and Cleopatra far from Egypt. And on the 2nd of September 31, an engagement took place at Actium, a promontory on the west coast of Greece. The basic strategy of the campaign was for the Egyptians to block any further movement south by the Romans. But Octavian had spies within the Egyptian high command, and the battle was a disaster for Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra was worried that the Roman fleet would outflank her and attack Egypt while she was gone, and rushed back to Alexandria, and Antony followed a few days later. This was depicted as cowardice on the part of Cleopatra, abandoning the battle, but it was the only tactical thing to do, to get back to Egypt as quickly as possible. The Eastern coalition that the two had built up quickly collapsed. Most notably, Herod the Great declared his loyalty to Octavian, which gave Octavian a base on the frontier of Egypt and cut Egypt off from the rest of Asia and Asia Minor. Cleopatra, now realizing that the Romans would attack Egypt, prepared to flee by building a fleet down on the Red Sea, perhaps hoping to reach Arabia and India. But the Arabians, who'd lost territory to her in Antony's realignments, burned the ships. Cleopatra also opened up negotiations with Octavian, asking that the kingdom be handed over to Kaisarian, and she would go into exile. This, of course, was impossible, because of Antony's careful promotion of Kaisarian as the one true heir of Caesar. By spring of 30, Octavian's armies had worked their way all around the eastern Mediterranean and were at the eastern frontier of Egypt. Antony took an army out to meet them, which promptly revolted and went over to Octavian's side. It was said that this was the work of Cleopatra, who now found Antony a liability and was still hoping for favorable terms from Octavian. On the 1st of August, 30 BC, Octavian entered Alexandria, and this is the date that the Ptolemaic kingdom officially came to an end. The tale now gets very romantic, but we can again kind of go through what the trajectory of events was. Cleopatra retreated to her mausoleum and sent word to Antony that she was dead. Her motives are unclear, but she thought that maybe this would allow Octavian to capture Antony, dispose of him, and return to Rome. Antony, however, bungled a suicide attempt and was brought to Cleopatra. We can go to 19th century artwork here, and hoisted up into her tomb to die in her arms at the age of 52. And the sources imply she was generally distraught at this, although she, in one sense, had brought it about. Antony was suffering badly from depression and alcoholism in his last years, and really was becoming very unreliable. The bright young man who'd worked with Caesar so many years before was essentially gone. Octavian allowed Cleopatra to bury Antony and leave the mausoleum to return to her palace. He wanted her to appear in the spectacle that he was planning in Rome. But she had no desire for this and attempted to starve herself to death. Octavian, who had taken custody of the children, threatened reprisals against them, and so ended that idea. Negotiations between the two dragged on for the next 10 days, but finally on the 10th of August in 30 BC, Cleopatra carefully arranged her own death. Again, it is one of the rare cases where we have an eyewitness account, because her personal physician Olympus recorded the details in a treatise that he published titled The Death of Cleopatra. And the story, of course, is a familiar one. She bathed and had a great banquet. She was brought a basket of figs by a man from the country. Her guards checked it and allowed it to pass. Cleopatra wrote a letter to Octavian, which we might consider a suicide note, in which she expressed the hope that her children would be well treated, still expecting that one of them would rule, and that she would be buried alongside of Antony. When Octavian received the letter, he realized what was happening. He rushed to the palace, but it was too late. She had locked herself in her quarters. Her guards didn't know anything that had happened, and Octavian found her dead, lying on her bed with her two ladies in waiting still barely alive. And we can look at two paintings here. We'll start with this one. This is actually a painting from Pompeii, and it has many attributions, but it may well be an almost contemporary depiction of the suicide of Cleopatra. One tip-off, which is very hard to see, is that the character on the left is holding a crocodile tray, which makes it indicate an Egyptian context. We can also see the doors up high. We know that Cleopatra's tomb had doors up high, and the woman is sitting taking poison or something like that. Maybe, maybe not. There are other attributions. Sophonisba is one of them. We don't really know, but we can go back to the 19th century with this familiar view of the death of Cleopatra. So, those of you who have some familiarity with the tale may have noticed that in my account of the death of Cleopatra, there's something I haven't mentioned, the most famous element, the asp. And in fact, from the very beginning, the idea that she died from an asp has been questioned. In a few years, Octavian had his great triumphal procession, and in it there was kind of a scenario, a montage or something like that of Cleopatra holding two asps to her breast. And that chronologically is kind of the first account of the asp. Strabo, who was in Alexandria a few years later on the Roman staff, wasn't sure about this asp story that was circulating around. Plutarch, who's the most detailed source, has Cleopatra found dead by Octavian. Remember, he's following the source of Cleopatra's physician, Olympus. But then he changes sources and says, by the way, let's talk about the ass. And it is said, which is a tip-off in Greek literature for meaning I'm not sure I believe this. It is said that an asp was killed in a basket of figs, although it's never explained exactly why this happened. Why should somebody spontaneously show up with a basket of figs with an asp in it? And Plutarch gives several versions of the asp incident, but also refers to poison in a comb. And it was also pointed out nobody ever found the asp. Octavian, however, said he saw puncture marks on her arm, and as we said in the triumphal procession, this is how she was depicted. Whatever happened, the asp story, which is logistically difficult, and herpetologists have gotten onto this and have said it really doesn't make much sense. Cleopatra probably used the suicide weapon of choice for royal women, and that's poison. But whatever happened, the asp's tale was enshrined in the record very, very quickly. Octavian was very angry. She'd slipped away from him, but nevertheless assured her burial with full royal honors next to Antony. She was 39 years of age. She'd lived an incredibly turbulent life. Suicide was an honorable way of leaving the world in an untenable position. And Cleopatra had few other choices. Her attempts at escape had failed, and given the propaganda wars of the last few years, playing into Octavian's hands would have been distasteful, to say the least. She was a skilled administrator and politician, but she had the misfortune to be caught up in a global environment that went far beyond her immediate interests, which were always the survival and security of Egypt. And her liaisons with both Caesar and Antony fit into this view. 2 relationships in 18 years. That's hardly the promiscuous slut she's depicted as. That's all we know about any personal relationship she had. She used her considerable talents and resources to further Antony's plan, but found him a liability in the long run, and eventually tried to distance himself from her, but it was too late. She wanted to see the continuation of a Greek monarchy. After all, Plato had called that the best of all governments, and Alexander the Great had validated it. Yet it was a world of increasing Roman control. And the Romans found monarchy anathema. They'd gotten rid of their kings hundreds of years previously. But ironically, Cleopatra was ahead of her time, because the Roman Empire would evolve into the kind of Hellenistic monarchy that Cleopatra represented. In the tradition of the Ptolemies, she was also a true intellectual and attempted to restore the cultural glory of her kingdom. The great Alexandria Library had suffered. She restored its collections. We have some hints of her education. Certainly her ability to speak at least 9 languages testifies to this. And we know she studied philosophy, rhetoric, and oratory with someone named Philostratus, and music with someone named Tigelius. She continued to attract scholars and artists to her own environment. And in the best Greek tradition, her children's tutor, Nicolaus of Damascus, ended up as Herod the Great's prime minister and is the primary source for the history of that turbulent kingdom. And many of the intellectuals from Cleopatra's Alexandria moved on to the court of Herod. And Cleopatra was a published author herself, writing a treatise on meteorology and allegedly cosmetics. Octavian took legal possession of Egypt by right of conquest, and it was officially annexed as a Roman province. One of his colleagues became the first Roman prefect. But Cleopatra's wishes for her children were not as she had hoped. Kaisarian, allegedly the true heir of Caesar and now 15, was too dangerous to survive. He'd been given vast financial resources and sent on the road to India, but was caught by Octavian's agents and executed. His role as heir and the fact he had a lot of money on him didn't help. Only one child of Cleopatra grew to maturity, and that's the girl, Cleopatra Selene, who became Queen of Mauritania, that's modern Algeria and Morocco, and an important personality in her own right. She created, along with her husband, King Juba, a Ptolemaic government in exile in her capital, Mauritanian Caesarea in Algeria, importing portraits of her mother, historic Egyptian art, and a scholarly presence that attempted to rival Alexandria. This is Mauritanian Caesarea, modern Churchill, and Algeria today. The royal palace was out on the island. This would be the Agora or Forum right here. And she and her husband were buried in a massive royal tomb, which obviously is still one of the major monuments of Roman Algeria. So what of her mother? What of the famous Cleopatra then? Soon after her death, the poet Horace, although working firmly within the tradition of the Roman winners who had demonized her, could not resist a summation of her character. She sought to die a more noble death and had no womanly fear of the dagger's point. Nor did she use her swift fleet to seek a remote shore. She dared to look with serene face on her fallen palace and was courageous enough to handle the deadly asp so that she could absorb the black venom within her body, becoming bolder as she decided to die, scorning the thought of being carried as a private citizen in a hostile procession for an arrogant triumph. She would not be a humiliated woman. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to entertain any questions. Yeah.
Do we have any,
I can't quite hear. Maybe you should come a little closer. It's hard.
sorry.
The mask doesn't help either.
Okay. Do we have any internal court, dialogue in Herod's court about his perception of Cleopatra?
In Herod's court, well, we have in Josephus, who copied Nicolaus of Damascus. We have a very detailed account of Herod's maneuvering at this time, more detailed than anything else. So the answer is yes. Josephus is a century later. But obviously this goes back to Cleopatra's own era. And the two of them were kind of warily tolerant of each other, each kind of afraid of the other, but dependent on each other. Yes, we certainly do. Yeah.
We have a question from someone watching online.
Yeah.
He asked, was Cleopatra more or less content to rule the Eastern Mediterranean or did she actually want Caesarion to assume Julius Caesar's position of power in Rome?
Well, the stories were, of course, that she was going to set herself up on the Capitol in Rome and be queen of Rome, but that seems unlikely. She was Egypt, and I think we have to keep in mind here that nobody knew at this time how powerful Rome would become. And so Rome, especially among the people in the East, was looked upon as an upstart. But so it probably was thought that Rome could be dismissed with, or at least pushed back into Italy. I don't think Cleopatra had any thought of moving into Rome. Antony's motives are a little more inscrutable, and it's almost impossible to figure out what he was up to. But if things had been a little bit different, probably the Ptolemaic Dynasty would have continued for another generation or two. And you have to remember the incredible political astuteness of Octavian played a role in this too. Yeah.
You had said that Cleopatra was the intellectual of the Ptolemies. Does that mean that her siblings or parents or other people in her family were not as intellectual and didn't learn as many languages?
Or not as learned.
Didn't learn as many languages?
So it seems, Plutarch explicitly says that none of Cleopatra's predecessors had even learned Egyptian. It's like the British in India who don't know any local languages and everything's in English. We don't know anything about the education of her siblings, whether they got the same kind of education she did or not. But that's one thing that makes her unique, that she was well educated, and it's unique not only for her own environment, but for a royal woman to be that well educated too.
We have another question from the chat.
Yeah.
Someone whose name is Devin, they said to tell you hi.
Yeah.
Did Cleopatra Selene honor her mother in Mauritania?
Oh yes, Cleopatra Selene did honor her mother in Mauritania. If you go to the museum that's in Caesarea now, the museum, which is right off to the right, there are portraits of Cleopatra VII. There are portraits of contemporary Egyptians. It's kind of a Ptolemaic government in exile. And it's very likely that Cleopatra Selene saw herself as the true heir and probably saw herself as Queen of Egypt. And so she and her husband Juba ruled all of North Africa in their own view. But yes, it's astounding. Here you are 1,000 miles from Egypt, and you walk into a museum full of Egyptian sculpture. And we know the names of some of the people at the royal court here in Mauritania, mostly through their tombstones. And there are a lot of Egyptians, so she imported a whole support group as well. But this dynasty didn't last very long. Juba and Cleopatra Selene had a child who, interestingly, was named Ptolemy. So again, the sense of reconstituting things. He got into trouble with the Romans. His cousin was Gaius Caligula, and he didn't last very long, is what I can say, and the Romans provincialized the kingdom. So it was a short, brilliant intellectual and cultural presence here in Mauritania and Caesarea.
Another question from chat. Why did you prefer to use seduction in reference to Cleopatra's relationship with Antony? Do we have the evidence?
Well, why do we say seduction? Obviously, in terms of the relationship, obviously the whole situation at Tarsus with what Shakespeare calls Cleopatra's barge is a carefully crafted situation. And it's much more than simply a member of Eastern royalty coming to negotiate with a Roman magistrate. All of the things that I read to you from Plutarch, with the serving maidens and Isis maidens and so forth, is a carefully contrived thing. And Cleopatra, now that Caesar was dead, needed some kind of contact, and I mean in a political as well as personal sense, within the Roman world if she was going to survive. So I think seduction is the right term here. We know more about Cleopatra's motives at this point than we do about Antony's. Although Antony did have a reputation for connecting with Eastern royalty, we have some other names of relatively obscure queens in Asia Minor that he had relationships with. But it's carefully crafted, no doubt about that. Okay. That about it? Well, thank you all.